Can I start with a question for you?
Sure.
I actually have two questions. One is to explain the difference between reincarnation and rebirth.
Okay.
Second one is something I've been thinking about a lot, is this idea of national or group karma, and now we're really thinking about world karma.
Yes, right.
In terms of, our future. So those two things. That will probably take the whole hour and a half, and then I could go home.
Well, the first one is kind of easy in the sense that it's a sort of English terminology choice. And in the West, people tend to use the term reincarnation. And so they use that in general. In the Buddhist context, I think reincarnation we would like to reserve in translating from Buddhist texts for the voluntary seeking of rebirth by a being that is not required to do so, which would be a high bodhisattva or Buddha who doesn't need a body to enjoy life. They can enjoy life magnificently without a body. It doesn't mean they're not alive, they are, but they just don't need there's a great expression that fits nicely with it that John Perry Barlow coined, the Electronic Freedom Foundation, which he calls meat space.
Meat space, right.
So reincarnation, carne means meat, in Spanish, and reincarnation means adopting a meat space body. Actually, Ram Dass, I was pleased, last year I went to see Ram Dass in Maui, and he uses the expression meat puppet. That's our meat puppet, not our spiritual subtle body, but our normal, what the Buddhist tantrics call coarse body or gross body. He calls it a meat puppet.
Meat puppet.
But of course it can be nice, meat puppet, if it's nicely formed and shaped and so forth, and well trained, and has studied dance and art with Meredith Monk. But anyway, the idea of that, then since that seems like a highfalutin type of way of rebirth, then that's how we would think to preserve the thing. Although it's arbitrary to the way
that reincarnation is sometimes understood as being more a Hindu idea of a soul that actually, that soul stays constant, whereas rebirth in the Buddhist tradition is much more that we aren't anybody anyway.
I know, but I must caution you, I'm a little bit of a heretic, although luckily I have Dalai Lama's backing. But we Buddhists have a soul too.
Mm-hmm.
But
I think so.
It's not a fixed soul.
Right, exactly.
It's not like a Social Security card that never changes the number.
Exactly.
It's a continuum at a super subtle level.
Exactly.
And actually recently Ram Dass was so happy, he said all his Buddhist friends, he was very upset that all his Buddhist friends don't want him to have a soul, and he's very upset about it because he's very into having a soul. So I said, that's all right, you can have a soul.
You're allowed.
Just so long as you realize that it also is all totally changing and it's super subtle, and it's sort of unconscious to you, and it's not a fixed little thing that they dish out they dish it out in the Vatican and hand it to you, and then you can just keep it.
Right. Exactly.
Keep it whether you're anything, male or female or whatever.
Right.
So
you keep your Medicare card.
Right. So it's sort of subtle. I was upset about it for a long time because then we Buddhists, we can't have soul food, we can't have soul music, we can't have, and why not? We do, because then there is the question, you have no self, people wrongly think. And then they say, well, how do you get reborn then? What is it that gets reborn? Well, the point is what gets reborn is a continuum. And Chitta Santana, in the Pali, it's really from the beginning, the continuum of mind. But then the subtle level of mind, we can use the word soul. I mean, when we translate these things, we are picking and assigning meanings to them. People have to realize, translators fight a lot about their special words, and then who's got the right word and which translator, and they practically kill each other over that. But in the Buddhist way, of course. But the point is, words are just conventional. Words, language are part of nature. They're like plants or like genes or little funny little things, and they change. So anyway, if we save reincarnation for a sort of conscious thing of someone who doesn't need to enter meat space in that way, but only does so out of compassion for others to interact with them, which is the theory of the Buddha having a beatific body, as I like to call it, the bliss body. Some people say enjoyment body, sambhoga kaya. And Sambhoga, the Sanskrit word, people don't know, it has a meaning in the Kama Sutra, Sambhoga. Because bhoga means to enjoy,
Right.
and sam means totally. So it means orgasm, actually, in the Kama Sutra.
Bliss.
But when they make it sound nice for Buddha, we say beatific,
Right.
beatitude. So anyway, so the so then rebirth, though, on the other hand, is what happens to the rest of us, which means that we have not learned to lucidly dream in life. We are very reactive, and we don't really, although we're working on it with our mindfulness. Sharon would not forgive any of us if we didn't constantly work on it. And we do, but we still have these places from the unconscious where we react unconsciously, and we gravitate, or we're repulsed by this, or we're obsessed with that. And deep lust and hate, Eros and Thanatos, dear old Freud, with his Eros and Thanatos, that he found in Vienna somewhere. And that they grip us, And so then when we die, we go into a kind of dream, and then driven by that lust and hate at the unconscious level, we can get dragged into forms of life that we really don't want to be in when we get there. We think maybe that's a good place we can escape over in this hole, or we can hide there, or we can adopt a big fierce form that would be a fierce body. And then suddenly we wake up in the form of being an armadillo, and we're not that happy. Armadillos are like, they're great, they're nice, they have well adaptation to their thing, but there's no foreplay. Armadillo caress is like a chalk on a blackboard. It's like, ooh, although they have a nice armored thing, it's not nice. So rebirth is kind of scary. And that's why in the West, since people escaped with the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment, they escaped from the Inquisition, from the church, they're into desperately not having a future life. And even so much so that they've convinced themselves that people who think there is a future life, not as a mystical thing, but as a common sense thing, are somehow wanting to prolong their ice cream consumption or something or other, assuming that people who have a common sense feeling of the future life are confident they're going to keep being reborn on the west side or the east side, if that's where they like to live, in a little bit better body where they already will know yoga from birth, So that's whereas when people really do know about future life, it's quite a terrifying thing to them if they know and they look at themselves honestly and they realize they cannot control their deeper unconscious mind. So that's why the Buddhists meditate all the time, because karma, a cause and effect, the most powerful level of cause and effect is the level of the mind. And of course, you can kill it with your mind, you can commit various lustful things with the mind, which you didn't do with the body or speech. But the fact of doing it even with the mind can then lead you in a negative direction. And therefore, since you can't control that deeper level, you're frightened of where it will take you. And therefore, you have to control your mind. And therefore, you have a culture that has like 10,000 Garrison institutes in every province. And Menlas, I might mention our little Menla mountain retreat up further north in Garrison. You have that's why those cultures have that. Because people, when they realize that and they say, gee whiz, I have to take responsibility for my mind, and I have to therefore learn how it works. So Sharon, please come and help me, or Joseph or Jack or whoever it is, And that's why mindfulness is sweeping the nation, I suppose, in a way.
But what each of us is born with traces or seeds of, we have traces or tendencies.
Yes.
And so it's not, not like a solid thing, but they're tendencies that if we learn about them and actually recognize them, we literally at any moment in our lives can change our karma.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yes, well, they are all the time.
The fluidity of that is something
changing
for people to know about.
And even I like to use the vasana as the word in Sanskrit, which relates to being perfumed. And instinct, is to tincture something. So I think really this is the preposterous claim of the Buddhists, that if you become a powerful enough meditator, you can actually change your instinctive reactions. And enlightenment, in fact, is defined as a person who is not driven by instinctive reactions. And that's a person who would only take rebirth voluntarily to help others. And that we like to say that's reincarnation, to come back to a question. And the ones who just get dragged by their unconscious instincts, then we call that rebirth.
Right.
Right? But you know, either one can be nice. Birth is great once it's over.
Right. I always understood old age, sickness, and death, but I was thinking, now what is so bad about birth? But I guess it's nice when it's over.
It is, it is. Well, the few times, I mean, I, of course, naturally do not have the equipment
it's a shock.
to deal with it, but I've been in the room a couple of times, and when, you know, even though we've prepared for natural and so on, as soon as it starts, I'm requesting the doctors and nurses give me a spinal. If she doesn't want it, I want it. You know, I can't take this. You know,
Right.
And I think that doesn't, of course, not to mention the baby, you know,
Right.
who's having
It's
kind
a
of a
shock.
rough time down there. You know, let's say.
So
that
now
was the
how
first
about the
question.
second question about group or national karma?
Yes.
And now world karma in relation
Right.
to our world,
Right.
because now it is
Well,
really universal.
Well, you know, the wonderful thing I think about the Buddhist educational movement, which I consider it more so than a religion almost, although it is a religion to some people, but really it's an educational movement and a civilizing movement that really changes all aspects of the life of a culture, as it did in India and Tibet and Mongolia and in East Asia, not totally, but not so totally, but it does do it in certain sectors. And I do consider that. And in what's called what I like to call the realistic worldview, which people usually say right to you know, right and wrong, which is not wrong.
No.
It's right.
Right.
But I don't think it's very good, because we associate right and wrong with following a rule.
Right.
Because we're used to an ethic where God tells you to do something, you know, authoritarian sort of thing.
Exactly.
Whereas in the Buddhist thing, it is ethical things are adopted and scientific things are adopted with a view to the reality of the situation. So I just love it. I have to give credit to Alan Wallace, who first used the term, but he doesn't always use it, because I guess it displeases some people who used to right and wrong, which is realistic. So samyak, what we call samyak in Sanskrit, is a realistic worldview, a worldview that takes account of reality. And then the real essence of realistic worldview is the acceptance of causation, of karma. And a belief in, that's the only thing you have to believe in. You don't have to believe in Buddha, you don't have to believe in the Dharma, you don't have to believe in the Sangha, you just have to believe in causation, which I really like that.
Me too.
As I've grown older, I really think it's very special. And why is that? Because our problem, the mental illness that we unenlightened beings have, is that we think that our essential identity is somehow disconnected from causation. You know, we were talking on behalf of nature, and of course we are nature, we're all natural phenomena, all of us. But we have this subliminal feeling that there's a fixed thing in there that's like the real Bob and the real Monk, the real Meredith, and it's sort of always there and it's separate from everything.
Exactly.
And if you want to prove it to yourself that you may have that, unless you're enlightened, in which case, I know I haven't offended you because you're not easily offended. If you're not enlightened, then you should think about it. And that is, you know, what I find the easiest way for people. You look at a family scrapbook or a picture of yourself 10 years ago or something, and in an event, you know. And then when you see yourself in that event, you sort of sometimes have to kind of remember what was going on and where were you and who was with you and whatever, you know. And then when you sort of click, oh yes, okay, I got it, because you look a bit different then than you do now. And so when you feel that you've got it, it's when somehow it seems to you that the same person was there, which was you as is here, thinking, remembering, and looking back in the picture book, you know? So there's something that didn't change. It's that point of unchanging subjectivity that we assume is sort of there registering things, you know? And that is the symbol of our mental illness, because of course there is no such thing. That was Buddha's discovery. It doesn't really mean we don't have selves, we do, but there's nothing that doesn't change.
Exactly.
So we're always changing, even at the subtlest level. So if we take a realistic view that causation really does exist, then we suddenly become responsible for our interconnection with everything.
Exactly.
Instead of having a feeling that we're somehow immune, and somehow maybe we choose not to be connected. Maybe we could escape into a nothingness, like all modern people think. They all think they're going to get out of here just by croaking, and all their problems will be solved, and the Republicans can do whatever they like to ruin the world. because they'll be dead, so they won't care.
Right.
But that's a complete, I love to say my favorite slogan, which I'm happy to repeat here in the Rubin. Again, when I'm especially talking about the Book of the Dead, I always say, nobody gets out of here a dead.
Nobody gets out of here what?
A dead. You know, instead of alive. Everybody's going to stay alive, which means what is the quality going to be of my life? Where am I going to live? What room will I book in the next life? What body will I book? You know, I'm really into booking when I go to the Bahamas. I'm really into booking like a good house or room or whatever, or a yoga center. I want to know I have a good accommodation, or Garrison. I want a good room. But the next life, what room, and how do you book that? That's the question.
Right.
That's
That is the question. But what
Yes.
about what
Now,
about
I
the
wanna ask
whole
you,
world? Oh yeah.
What's that?
You
What about on behalf of nature? I love your work, and I love you, actually.
Thank you. Me too.
I really do.
Me too.
And you're a monk.
Good name, right?
I'm an ex-monk.
And now
sorry.
I've been a monk my whole life.
I know that. That's amazing. I mean, that really is your birth
That
name?
really is my birth
Really?
name.
So then your dad was a monk too?
Yes, the
No
monk
kidding.
family, the
But
crazy
somehow
monk family.
He was a non-celibate monk, or he wouldn't
he
have
was a
achieved
non-celibate
you.
monk.
He wouldn't have
That's
been lucky
right.
enough to have been visited by
That's
you.
right.
So that's wonderful, you know. and so then how are you, you know, you have various ways of representing nature. Mm-hmm. And I just would like you to tell us about your favorite one, or one or two, or whatever.
I'll tell you a little bit about how On Behalf of Nature was formed, because
Yes. Okay.
I think in our world now, as artists, we're trying to figure out how to do work that's useful and is of benefit. You know, can art be of benefit? Can
Yes.
it be useful?
Yes.
So I was thinking about the environment, and was distraught about what's happening.
It
so
is distressing.
So I did read at a certain point in I think it was Buddha Dharma, a wonderful article by Gary Snyder, who was a poet, is a poet.
Oh, he is.
Was
Yes, indeed.
considered one of the beatnik poets, but he was really quite different than the other people.
Yes.
As each of them was.
I love Gary.
A very, very early environmental activist. So some of his early writings are so prescient of what's going on now.
Oh, of course.
And he's also a Zen practitioner. So he wrote this whole article called Writers and the War Against Nature. And he started talking about ancient peoples, the shamanic tradition,
Mm-hmm.
that there were two functions. One was to tell the truth,
Mm-hmm.
and the other one was to speak on behalf of nature, or to speak on behalf of beings that couldn't speak through dance and song, he said.
Mm-hmm.
And that was so inspiring, so I was and then I started working on it. And then as I started working on it, I thought, how did I ever take on behalf of nature? This is too much, because all my pieces are about nature on a certain level. And I didn't really want to do a piece like, now make sure that you don't throw your plastic bags out, this kind of polemic, finger pointing kind of piece.
Oh,
because
yes,
my
yes.
work is very nonverbal and kind of, more like poetry.
Right.
So we went in, and I certainly didn't want people to be running around the stage going tweet, 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 to like trying to imitate nature. That didn't seem to make sense. It was a hard process. I mean, I went through a lot of processes to figure out how to work with this. So what I came to the conclusion was to create music and very simple movement, but mostly music that, in a sense, reflected the kind of energy and motor of life, of nature, that reflected the rhythms of nature. And then by doing that, as an audience seeing that somehow you would get that sense of the sadness of losing that. And that in a very, in a kind of emotional way rather than a kind of straight ahead political way. And that maybe you would go home and think about doing something different in your life. So that's really how it happened. One of the things I was thinking about is, how do you make a piece? Usually if you make a piece, you spend money, you buy costumes, you have, objects or whatever it is, and, it costs something. And I was thinking, how do you make a piece that doesn't have any waste in it at all? Because you do the piece, the costumes go into a suitcase and they go up into storage. So they're just sitting there. So how would I make a piece that doesn't have that layer of footprint left behind? So what we did, I have a wonderful designer that I work with, Yoshio Yabara. He's a Japanese person living in Berlin. I've worked with him since 1980. So, very soulmates in art. And so we had people in the cast bring in their own clothing And then Yoshi took apart the clothing and made a new
How lovely.
création. And then what we did was, in the piece there were 3 sections, and each person had like this garment that was made up of all the scraps of their clothes, and each person had a kind of shape. So for example, the first color scheme, it was also very visual, so first color scheme was blues, kind of sea colors. Then you would leave the stage at a certain point and change your clothes into a brown and green version of exactly the same shape. So it was as if it transformed into another color of the same shape. So each person was very unique, and yet we were part of a world of nature.
It's wonderful.
So it was a wonderful process. And then finally we did an exhibit of his drawings, and he had us all write about the garments. So I had this little mini dress as part of mine that he had taken apart, and I said, this was a mini dress that I wore in the 1960s. That is part of the costume. And then one of our people, John Hollenbeck, had some pants, and he said, these are pants that my wife actually hated. And so I gave them up, and I'm so glad that they're remade into a new garment. So that was one strategy of the piece.
That's quite lovely. It makes me think, actually, of the shamanic calling. You know, when you say speaking on behalf of nature. I've recently been learning a little more about shamanism from my friend Isa. I don't know if you ever bumped into her in the West Coast. Isa Gucciardi.
Yes, Isa.
And so I've been learning a little about it. But of course, in the old days, I read Iliada's, archaic techniques of ecstasy, in which he talks about the shamanic calling, how someone at a certain age in a more indigenous society, more connected to nature, in teenage years maybe, or in the early 20s, they have like a nervous breakdown, and they completely let go of themselves. They open themselves to the world, and they give up their sort of human programming, or it sort of leaves them one way or the other. And then the different powers of nature, like the bear figure, or the rabbit figure, or the monkey figure, or the owl, or whatever it is, they come back, and then they re-put themselves together as to speak for these different factors and elements in nature. Like I have, you see this, my wife gave me for my birthday, but it was made by, I think, Navajo. And you see the bear there.
Yes.
And the bear in their culture, I was told, I don't really know, it represents introspection. So it's very useful to me because I have like a hot temper, and I'm still trying to work on it after 50 years.
Me too.
And then when I'm feeling a little agitated, I look at the bear, right.
Calm down, cool out.
Calms me down. And more seriously.
I mean, it's always that tradition of going to
literally
going to death, to the gate of death, and then reforming.
That's right.
Which I think artists do also. It's a kind of calling.
Of course.
And you literally go down to the bone and then reform.
Absolutely.
To be able to be a spokesman of what's coming through you.
That's
spokesperson.
Right. That's so beautiful. The second person this week was 2 nights ago at Tibet House. We gave Martin Scorsese an award called the Art of Freedom. And he's so brilliant and philosophical, that man. I was quite impressed, And he said he was accepting the award, right? But then he was saying, art of freedom. Oh, yes, right. Yes, art has to come out of freedom. And freedom from, yes, what is it? He didn't quite go to freedom. True freedom is death, actually.
Right.
True freedom, French have an expression about orgasm.
Right.
Le petit mort, the little death. And the Zen master has an expression for enlightenment. It's a great death, they have. And in Tibet, it's always on the edge of life and death. You can't really understand life until you really face the death, and you overcome the denial of it. And so he was philosophically saying, yes, right, well, art, it comes out of freedom, and freedom is where you have to let everything go. And then I guess the creativity comes up. He was like thinking out loud in one of those settings where you're just accepting an award at a dinner. I was like, wow, he's a philosopher. And then he said, and what makes it come up, of course, I guess it's love, he says.
Exactly.
Wasn't that?
Yeah, exactly.
So that's just what you're saying.
And it's also being quiet enough and actually going into the process of making something with no expectation at all. It's like beginner's mind.
Yeah.
And having no expectation. And then I'm very afraid. I've been working 52 years, and every time I'm just terrified with a new piece, which, happens every time. You would think that you wouldn't have
a new piece.
Well, every time I do a new piece. But what I do is I say to myself, number 1, take it step by step, little by little. Number 2, remember playfulness.
Yes.
And no expectation whatsoever. And then little by little, you'll find a teeny weeny little thing. It's like a little clue. It's like being a detective. You'll find a little teeny thing that maybe you've never done before or never heard before.
That's great.
And then the curiosity and the interest starts taking over and the fear starts going away little by little. Then you know you're on the right track. Plus, I think when you figure out what the question of a piece is, then you know you're on the right track. I think every piece has a question.
I think you're right. That is when you teach also is a thing where if you go into teaching something to someone or a group of people and you sort of have it all controlled and planned, and you read a written lecture or script, it's just so boring and so terrible. And in a way, you have to kind of let go of everything.
Exactly.
And then trust that something will come.
And be that vulnerable.
And yes, and one of my earliest teacher, actually, an elderly Mongolian gentleman, when he would get up to teach in some setting, he had this habit of just not saying anything for a while. And people would I myself even listen, okay, say something. How people feel like, now it's your turn to talk, say something. He would just, and I could feel people thinking, maybe he's an idiot, maybe he doesn't know anything, maybe he doesn't speak English, it was like this. And then suddenly he would say something, but there was always that kind of thing.
And don't you think the great teaching don't you think that the great teaching always has that sense of vulnerability? Because I know when I first started doing the Shambhala training many years ago, I remember this one teacher, Doug Pennick, and he was literally shaking during the time he was and it was so moving, because that vulnerability is also something that is a very good thing as a performer, because we are in the same space at the same time. It's immediate, and that immediacy is also a real Buddhist principle. So when I started working, which was many years before I started practicing, how I found out about all of this was that I was asked to teach at Naropa. So it was in the mid-'70s. And I was very moved by and I taught and I also performed, and I was very moved by the quality of the attention of the audience, and that kind of very expansive and very relaxed and very focused attention. And so for a number of years I hovered about, I listened to Trungpa's speeches, I hovered about, but I was very prejudiced against any organized anything, as we all were, suspicious. Then at a certain point, I really started practicing, and I realized that some of the principles that I had as an artist, the aesthetic principles, were so close to what are really Buddhist principles, which immediacy, fluidity of time and space, expansiveness, and vulnerability. And so it seemed like a very natural. Very natural extension.
Yes, I had a funny experience with His Holiness one time in Atlanta at Emory University. He was on stage with Richard Gere and Alice Walker in a thing on art, And so, of course, at the beginning, and he's a visiting professor there at Emory. They have a nice thing that they did years ago, and they withstood the Chinese consulate and made him a visiting professor. And he goes often once a year, or he used to. And so right away they looked to him, of course Richard and Alice looked to him to say something. But he immediately disclaimed saying anything. He said, oh, I don't know anything about art. You guys talk, you make him up. So everybody's very disappointed. So then they filled in and they did well. And he was kind of like not really into the conversation because he had this idea that art was painting something or doing something, and that it wasn't something he knew about. So
I have to tell you a story about this.
He wasn't going to say anything. What's that?
I have to tell you a funny story about this after you finish your story.
So, well, you want to say now, or you finish?
You finish.
So then I had a meeting with him afterwards about a project we were doing. I managed to get a minute. It's very hard with the court, to get a minute. Even if you're new, well, what's the point? I come to a group meeting, and if you know him for years, you don't need to talk to him again. They always have an excuse.
Right.
But anyway, I managed to get precious few minutes, but I couldn't use it for the job we were talking about because I had to say to him, "Listen, Your Holiness, please don't say that. Art is the seventh paramita, the seventh transcendent perfection. Upaya, that's the real translation of upaya. The skillful means business, as some British pathetic thing, means. The House Ways and Means Committee, you know, like really skillful means. It's so like means, like you're going to be mean. How can you have a transcendence of means, you know? I mean, you can, of course, but it's just so boring. So, but actually it's art.
Right.
Because, and it follows the sixth paramita, which is that, you know, wisdom paramita, where you meet emptiness, you confront the reality of the world, and it all dissolves around you. And even then the being dissolves, and so there you're again involved in it all. But now you're free in a certain way, in that you died as far as your normal, pushing your normal identity against it, you know, type of thing. You melt into it, let's say, blissfully, luckily.
Blissfully.
And then you melt out of it, and then you melt back into it, because there's no place out of it. That's the funny thing, right? Emptiness. So after emptiness, there should be compassion, of course. But what is compassion, actually? Just, oh, poor people, what's the matter with them?
That's idiot compassion.
That's not really compassion. That is a kind of mode of compassion, but it doesn't do anything for the people. The worst thing for someone who's suffering is someone saying, oh yeah, I'm with you there in the suffering. Let's all suffer together more. And then, thank you, but I'm suffering quite enough on my own, you know? I don't need somebody adding to my suffering. So actually what the suffering person needs is someone help to bring them out of the suffering. And what is that? That is art. Right. It is art that does it, because, you know, people, you know, are mentally ill, and they think they're separate from the world, all of them, and they think they're separate from the world. And so if you rush up and give them a big bliss hug, they're going to think you're into SmackDown or something, and they get all paranoid and more uptight. So you have to figure out some way, open a door for them, to try to begin to open up, to discover their own inner bliss, which is actually their life force and their health and their themselves being a part of nature, right? Exactly. So that's what you have to do. Right. So then how do you do that? Art. Art, exactly. That's art. Yeah. And it comes straight from the void, clear light of the void. Exactly. Right? So then now what's the story you can... So wait, let me finish. Okay. So then I told His Holiness, I said, so you can say, I know a lot about art. That's compassion. You know, that's compassion in action, because compassion without action is not compassion. And it's the art of bringing people out of suffering into enjoying life and counting their blessings and knowing what their true nature is, which is part of this wonderful nature that we are all graced with, you know, this incredible thing.
I think of it as I think of it as an antidote to the poison.
Yes.
You know, it's a kind of antidote right now.
So
it's love. Exactly.
It's love.
Comes from love.
That's why you have such shining eyes. And so bright and nice.
I'm so lucky.
What?
I'm so lucky.
Of course you are. We're lucky here with you, but we're also just lucky to be alive. Also.
That's right.
We are. In Tibetan, I was telling Meredith, it was before, when you reach a certain age, which I have reached, when someone asks you, how are you? You're allowed to say, after 70, you're allowed to say, Mashidamla.
Mashidamla.
And that means just barely not dead.
I love it.
And Tibetans think that's just great. They love it. But if you try to say that when you're 50 or 60 or 30, you're a youngster, like, what's the matter with you? You know, they won't accept it. But after that, they say it and they like it. They think, oh, you're being realistic or something like that. Now, what is your story? So, so the Dalai Lama got really inspired by that, but it was too late for Alice and Richard. But nevertheless, in the future, hopefully he will do that. I sang for him in 1997 at the World Sacred Music Festival. Oh, great.
So I watched this documentary.
Where was that?
This was in Los Angeles.
In Los Angeles.
And it happened to be in Temple Sinai. Now, I come from an Eastern European Jewish background.
Yes.
My father had just died, and so there I was back in Sinai Temple singing for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So it was like really great. But the thing that was really funny was, so I watched a documentary about him, and the interviewer said, well, what kind of music do you like to hear? And he said, I don't like music. So I thought, what am I going to sing for this guy? So I know he likes to laugh. So I first sang one piece that had a lot of space and overtones. The other thing about it was that there was a monk that was sitting next to me glaring at me like the whole time before I went up to sing.
He was what, glaring?
Glaring at me.
Oh, glaring at you?
Yes, glaring at me.
The monk who was sitting next to
The monk was sitting next to me in the audience, and then I had to walk up and sing. I have no idea.
Okay.
So I went up, so I sang one song that had a lot of space, and you know, it was a little bit like an invocation, but then I sang my click song where I'm singing and clicking at the same time.
Oh, really?
And His Holiness was looking like this. Then I did my Jew's harp piece, and he was like, and then I went back to my seat, and he thanked the rabbi for giving him, I think they gave him a silver, cup or something like that.
Yeah.
He also said a very interesting thing about the Jewish culture, which was, he said, Tibetans can learn from the Jewish culture because the Jewish culture has been without a home for 2,500 years.
Yes, he has a big thing about that.
And that was really beautiful. But
yes.
So then he said, but I really want to thank the lady, the way she uses the human voice. She must do a piece, her next piece must be with like this. And every once in a while he'd be looking at me in the middle of his speech, and then the monk said, yes, you must. And then he took my Jew's harp and he was going boing, 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 boing. The monk came in. So that's the story.
I love it. Well, he's, first of all, His Holiness loves to be a naughty boy at whatever age. He loves to be contrary. He really does. You can find that on the YouTube, at a conference. I don't know where it was, and it was on. It's a short thing on YouTube, and His Holiness is there, and this lady, black lady, must be, but he hasn't been to Africa because Chinese, but it might have been in India or something. But an African lady with the magnificent kind of hair thing and the fabulous,
clothing,
textile, etc. She's monitoring, and he's there with the interpreter, just the three of them in the YouTube, and you don't see the audience. And she's asking about this and that, and then she asks him if he gets tired traveling and something. So it's a little bit like that. Probably there was other things that he said, but then he looks thoughtful when she asks him about it, and then he says, well, he said, it isn't really, I don't mind traveling. He says, it's okay. He says, but one thing is kind of difficult, he said, because you eat all different kinds of food that doesn't necessarily agree with you, when you're traveling, he says. And then sometimes when you're in the airplane, he says, well, you get a little gas, he says. And then, he says, you don't know what to do, and you feel this gas, and you look around, he said. He said, and he goes like this, and you look around, he says, and then, somehow you just have to let one out. And it's pandemonium. On the YouTube, it is pandemonium.
That's great.
And you can hear it, everybody. And the lady is like this, and the translator is like, he's turning bright red. And Nakalam is looking completely delighted. He's just delighted with himself. And the way I understand things, I think, he is healing a bunch of incipient Crohn's disease victims. And, they're having chronisms in the colon. Like at least for 500 people in the audience of 10,000.
Absolutely.
The idea of this holy person is taking
great.
the mind there to that part of nature.
So great.
And reality, that's really part of it.
What can you do?
It's very, very funky, but imagine
very real.
The way he does it. You have to let one out. I almost fainted. I thought, what? I myself. And then I had a good laugh too. So he's like that. He's really naughty. He manifests. He speaks of nature. He's totally involved with nature. And I really think there's nothing more we can do. I'm really for these young rebels in the House of Representatives who are chasing Nancy around, who I adore, by the way, personally. But she's my age too. And she was, bipartisan, she says, with these criminals who are they're, with the mafia lord, pretending that it doesn't matter if he's a criminal. Or that the Russians are controlling our foreign policy, which is very bad for us. And not because it isn't the Russians, they're beautiful people. It's the KGB is what it is. Same bunch of people that we were having a Cold War with when we realized that. But anyway, point is, those people are insisting that we're not going to coddle the petroleum industry anymore. And that's correct. What is this? We could have done this if Gore had won, as he did. Gore did win. I'm sorry, there may be some Republicans among you. If we have real Republicans are conservatives. Conservatives want to conserve the environment. Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican. Right. He created Yellowstone Park, Yosemite Park. Right. You know, Republicans
even
saved
the
the
first
Palisades
Bush
when they
was.
were the Democrats were blowing them up to get money, to get gravel to make concrete for New
Right.
York City. So real Republicans are conservative. They're not these radical, insane, zinky. Zinky is like some kind of subhuman
Zinky.
species, like
Right.
with scales,
I
like
was
crawling.
thinking-
Talk about the swamp. He's a swamp creature. You know? Totally, those guys. And this is intolerable.
It's intolerable.
The planet, Mother Earth doesn't want it, and our grandchildren
Mother
don't
Earth is
want
showing
it.
her power
And
now.
there's nothing to do but to see to it. In Germany, I don't know if people know that, but you know, it's like not a big mystery. It's not rocket science. When my beloved Angela Merkel turned off the nukes in Germany after Fukushima, and she shifted the subsidies also away from petroleum industry to the distributed energy production, you know, then within 5 years, the electricity was so plentiful and cheap in a northern climate. Hamburg, you know, Germany has like a long
Freezing cold.
summer and a dark winter, and they were doing fine. Of course, they needed some substitute, and they didn't have all the right infrastructure to save it, and the battery system. And Elon Musk had not come back from Mars yet, but still, it showed that this can happen very, very quickly. We are still giving worldwide, the different governments, not just us, but many governments are giving maybe almost $1 trillion in subsidy to the oil industry to keep finding stranded assets, which is completely suicidal.
Right, it's suicidal.
And it has to be spoken against at once.
You just...
And even, of course, Merkel was defeated, then they started buying coal and things,
Right.
the idiots, you know. And then the utilities were frightened because a lot of pension funds in Germany were invested in utilities and the stock was going down. So then they kind of, let's back off from that because of being stuck in the sort of routines, you know. But, you know, immediately should be speaking for the environment. Al Gore, I hope he follows that. He told me, he promised me recently, he was going to invite me to Atlanta and train me since I'm retiring from Columbia, and I used to yak all the time, you know, lecture, and I don't have a classroom anymore. So I said, I will go give that lecture for you, because he has this data and this wonderful thing.
Yeah.
And tonight I'm getting the idea that if I do that, because we can have a different thing, you can join me sometimes in some venues and do your, like, whatever, like wear old clothes or wear masks or dance.
Do my music, do my singing.
Whatever. But you give them a little live
Right.
thing. But what he has are these big screens, and on the big screens he has a team, and it was amazing. I saw it in San Francisco about a month ago. And on the screen, he right away had North Carolina, very vivid footage that was frightening. And he had the typhoon in Philippines and whatever it was. He had like all the immediate things that are going on, the actual proof that the whole thing is out of balance.
Absolutely.
You know? And it was very powerful. And the other great thing, though, don't get too freaked out. The great thing, after terrorizing you for 35 minutes in a 1-hour lecture, he then shows you a bunch of statistics about the level of investment going into renewables all over the planet, even India, even China, that shows that we can easily meet the thing, actually. And we are the laggards here, and we, of course, because we have these complete, you know, KGB conspiracy in the White House. That's a KGB conspiracy right there in the White House. Naturally, they want to wreck our country, you know, because we show that their country, they should get off the backs of their own beautiful, lovely Russian people, who are among my favorite people, and they're so wonderful.
I was just there.
Wonderful people. They don't like their KGB.
No, they don't.
They're just scared of them.
We just performed in Perm.
What's that?
We just performed in Perm, Russia, in June, and
wait, where?
In Perm.
PM?
Perm, they call it, but it's P-E-R-M, Perm.
Oh, Perm.
But they say Perm.
Oh, yeah, everything is Pia in Russia.
And they,
so cold,
wonderful town. We did a piece called Cellular Songs, which is my last piece, which is even going deeper into the source of life.
In Russia just now?
Yes, in June.
Oh, that is so great.
And it was just wonderful.
They love you, don't they?
It was wonderful.
They are marvelous people.
So deep.
They really are deep.
Yeah,
of course, they've suffered a lot under their nasty totalitarian
but I guess that's
dictatorship.
the thing that I keep on thinking about with these, you know, Hungary, one of my favorite places, Poland. If these people have suffered so much, and Brazil, why would you want to suffer some more, you know, with another dictatorship in your country?
They don't really. They're just frightened by like media,
fear.
by this terrible example. that this, whether we all see all the faults, even when we have Obama, we get sick of Obama. I get sick of him, like prancing around, Mr. Cool, and like not doing a climate change deal himself, and kicking out Van Jones, the Love Army guy. He kicked him out right quickly because he didn't want to rattle this and that donors, so he'd get reelected. So, you even find fault with our own people, our own lesser of evils people. But still, America is seen by people abroad as like, Michael Jackson, bad, really bad.
Yeah. But now it's just seen like
even,
crazy people.
Those two evil characters that we all saw in Argentina.
Yeah.
The Saudi guy who murdered sadistically the journalist, and the Putin guy who has murdered American democracy temporarily, sadistically also, doing a high five. So they're celebrating that they can kill anybody and do anything they want, right? They think they're so intoxicated with their power. But meanwhile, what is a high five? A high five is a U.S. cultural, hey.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're completely captivated by that, even themselves, even though suppressing all the high fives of their own population.
Right.
Because that's maybe out of control.
Right.
Send the NKVD, send them to a gulag if they do too many high fives. But we're doing high fives. So we're the American dream. We're Dallas or something. They're captured by something that emerges from some kind of freedom here that is somewhere underground, even though we've never really lived up to it all the way.
Right.
But we've opened the door to it. In America.
Right.
And so we sort of
have
forget
the myth of it.
As I said to a certain person who I won't mention by name, but who I believe was involved in Gore's seeming loss.
Right.
Well, actually, he was cheated, of course, in Florida and so on, but still, it seemed like he lost, but he really won. But anyway, who contributed that? I said to him, man, you went to Princeton. I said, what can't you get about the syllogism? Lesser of evils equals less evil.
Right.
What's wrong with that?
Right.
Oh, he just went nuts, about how Jimmy Carter did this and that, Oh, money, criminal.